Hello, my name is Dr. Todd Robinson. I'm here today to talk about a whole person approach to managing stress. A little background about myself before I get into it. I'm a naturopathic doctor. I've been in practice for 10 years, based out of Jacksonville Beach, Florida. I'm here today representing Allergy Research Group. I'm the Senior Manager of Scientific Education and Product Support. So I'll be talking about stress, the whole person approach to managing it, but also highlighting some ARG products that could be useful for managing stress. Let's get started. So, stress, I think, is a very important time to be thinking about stress, to be talking about stress. Like I mentioned, I've been in practice for 10 years. I work mostly with cancer patients, and so you can imagine that stress, both acute stress, chronic stress, is a big issue with those folks. But I will say that in the last 2 years, the relevance of stress and the impact that it's had on my patients has absolutely increased. It seems like people who were easy breezy before are now having difficult time grappling with stress. And it makes sense given the recent pandemic. It makes sense given the political climate. We're sort of all stewing in a crucible of stress. And so it's a very important time to be talking about it. So a little bit of background. Stress is a term that was coined by this gentleman, Dr. Hans Sale. And he was the researcher that actually coined the term stress. He had a many decades long research career, very distinguished researcher, and he defined stress as a non-specific response of the body to any demand made upon it. Since he coined this term, there's been significant research that's been conducted on stress. And so, of course, we've kind of fleshed out our understanding of stress and the body's response to stress. So here's an infographic, a diagram that sort of explains a little bit more about what we currently understand of how stress impacts the body. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into all the details on this, but there are a couple of points that I would like to highlight. So number one, you can see at the very top of this infographic that word stressor. So this would be the external stimulus that the body is responding to. And I think what's important to realize or recognize, as you can see underneath that, there's physical stressors, and then there's emotional or psychological stressors. So physical stressors are easy to understand in many respects, right? You're walking through the woods, you come across a bear, it growls at you, there's a direct physical threat to your health and well-being. So that is a physical stressor. Psychologic stressors are different. The best example that I can think of is if you're the main breadwinner for your family and you're concerned about potentially losing your job and the consequences of that. That's not a direct physical threat per se, but it is a psychological stressor. And I think what's important to realize is physical, psychological, or emotional, the system and the cascade is very, very similar between the two. So almost like our body doesn't know the difference between the threat of the bear and the threat of losing your job and not being able to support your family. So it sets off the same physiologic cascade. Two other points. Number one is you can see that there's two axes that are talked about here. There's the SAM axis and the HPA axis. Those involve different circuits and different systems in the body, and they mitigate like acute stress versus chronic stress. So we often think of the SAM axis as being the acute stress pathway. So you're walking through the woods, you see that bear, it growls at you, your brain acknowledges what it is, it acknowledges that it's a physical threat and sets off this cascade that ends up spitting a lot of adrenaline into your system. That adrenaline will increase your heart rate, dilate your pupils, and overall get your body ready to run away from the bear. That's the purpose of that system. The HPA axis, on the other hand, is considered to be the mediator of long-term or chronic stress. And you can see in this diagram that they do talk to each other. So if you have repetitive and frequent triggering of this SAM axis or acute stress cascade, it will impact the function of that HPA axis. So to return here, you'll see on the slide at the bottom, there's this abbreviation GCs. That stands for glucocorticoids. So these are a type of hormone that secreted in response to stress, in response to the activation of the HPA axis. And one of the main glucocorticoids we think about is cortisol. So cortisol is a major player in the HPA axis. It's a major player in the body's long-term response to stress. And so what you see here is a brief overview of some of the functions that cortisol actually has in the body. So cortisol will increase energy production. It will compel the body to sacrifice fat and protein for the production of energy. It increases blood sugar. Again, this is to make energy more readily available for running away from the bear. It will suppress the immune system. It does suppress immune function over time, and it suppresses inflammation. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see this diurnal cortisol curve. This is to represent the normal curve of cortisol secretion over the course of a 24-hour period. So you see that cortisol peaks in the morning and steadily is supposed to peak in the morning and steadily decline over the course of the day. So you can think of cortisol as being sort of the wake you up hormone. Oftentimes it's thought of in conjunction with melatonin. Melatonin is the bedtime hormone, cortisol is the wake you up hormone. What happens with chronic stress, we start to see altered cortisol rhythms. So you can see cortisol levels that are too high at inappropriate times of the day. You can see cortisol levels that are too low at inappropriate times of the day. And that has dramatic impact on how well the body is functioning. And it has dramatic impact and mediates how stress impacts the body and our long-term health. This is another interesting concept that's emerging in the research literature. So it's not, long-term stress is not just about cortisol levels being too high or too low. There's some indication that it is also about resistance, cortisol resistance, or glucocorticoid resistance rather. So the body can potentially become less receptive to the input of glucocorticoids. So this is a situation where you can have someone who's got elevated cortisol, which you'd think would be suppressing inflammation, but if there's that receptor resistance, they can have elevated cortisol and elevated inflammation at the same time. And this is the root of how that might happen. So my point is, balance in the stress response system is the key to maintaining long-term health in the face of chronic stress. So what happens is an appropriate and well-balanced acute response can become a detrimental long-term response when the system is thrown out of balance. So the question is, what do you do about that? We can't control external circumstances, at least not completely, but we can try and control our body's response to those external circumstances, and in that way, hopefully balance our physiology, balance our response to those stress inputs. So one option is, of course, meditation. Meditation, through multiple studies, has been shown to reduce a lot of stress parameters. So reductions in anxiety, depression, mental health-related quality of life, pain, and then other markers of stress and distress. So meditation is one. And I like this approach because it gets at the root cause. It gets at the root imbalance within the HPA axis. Another potential option for helping to balance the HPA axis and improve the body's response to stress and chronic stress is the use of various adaptogenic herbs. So these botanicals have been used in traditional medical systems around the world for a long time. They're used for many purposes. Sometimes it's a bit confusing if you're not used to traditional botanical medicine. You can look at the traditional indications for these botanicals and become confused because it seems like they're useful for everything. The reason for that, well, one of the emerging reasons for that, is that adaptogenic herbs have a normalizing effect on the physiology. So if your cortisol levels are too high, adaptogenic herbs can help bring it down. If your cortisol levels are too low, adaptogenic herbs can help bring it up. They have what's referred to as a pleiotropic effect, which is essentially bidirectional. It'll bring you in the direction your physiology and your body needs to go. So here's a product offered through Allergy Research Group that is, in my opinion, an excellent, I didn't formulate it, but I think it's an excellent formula. And it does rely on the use of multiple adaptogenic herbs. So one of the main features or highlights of this particular product is this extract, Rilora, which is a combination of magnolia and philodendron. And so this particular extract has been studied in humans, and looking specifically at its ability to modulate the stress response and improve stress over time. And over the 4 weeks that these folks in this trial were taking Rilora, we saw normalization of both objective measures of stress physiology, so cortisol levels, but also normalization of some of the subjective measures. The patients reported lower anxiety, better mental health, etc. So Rilora is one of the key ingredients in this particular product. And those herbs are considered to be adaptogenic, so they're helping to normalize abnormal physiology. And then one of the ingredients is ashwagandha. This is a very, very, very common, very famous herb now at this point. It's considered, sometimes referred to as Indian ginseng. So it's traditionally used in Ayurvedic medicine. There's been a lot of studies to show that it boosts thyroid function, it reduces anxiety, it improves sleep. And so this also has adaptogenic effects where it will regulate or normalize cortisol over time. Lemon balm. Lemon balm isn't necessarily considered an adaptogenic herb. It falls into the category of nervines, meaning it is relaxing. So lemon balm has a nice relaxing and anti-anxiety effect, so it's a good option for sort of a stress relief formula. And then chamomile. I love the addition of chamomile in this formula because chamomile is a little bit like lemon balm insofar as it's soothing, calming, relaxing, without being sedating, but it is also anti-inflammatory. So chronic stress, as we'll see in a little bit, can have an impact on gastrointestinal function, and chamomile is potently anti-inflammatory and can help soothe some of that digestion. So it's a great addition to this formula. So meditation or the use of adaptogenic herbs is a good way of addressing sort of the root cause of chronic stress, helping to balance the SAM and HPA axis. But you can also take a systems-based approach where you look at the impact that stress has on individual systems within the body. And so we know that stress and chronic stress will impact brain function, it will impact endocrine function, it will impact the gut, it will impact the heart. So there's a lot of different systems that will be impacted negatively by chronic uncompensated stress. So it's beyond the scope of what I can talk about here to talk about all of that, because that's a ton of information. So I'm going to focus on these 5 systems and talk a little bit about strategies for how to improve or regulate. So the first, cardiovascular system. What do we see in the case of chronic stress? We see a lot in the cardiovascular system. So we see increased risk of having high blood pressure. We see increased risk of endothelial dysfunction. So the endothelium is essentially the lining inside blood vessels. It's important for regulating the contraction and relaxation of those blood vessels. So if the endothelium is dysfunctional, your blood vessels cannot expand and contract the way they're supposed to, and that leads to multiple long-term problems. We see a lot of inflammation within the cardiovascular system in the face of chronic stress, and we also see altered coagulation cascade. So there's a greater tendency in the presence of inflammation to create blood clots, that sort of thing. And so these are sort of the impacts that chronic stress has on the cardiovascular system. So one potential approach or one potential strategy for alleviating some of that is lumbrokinase. Lumbrokinase is a proteolytic enzyme. That means it helps to break down proteins. It's a fibrolytic enzyme, so it helps to break down fibers. And so in human studies, it has been shown to improve the coagulation and blood flow. And so this was sort of a proof of concept study that it was bioactive in humans, and then it did in fact improve some of their coagulation markers without any adverse effect. So, and then another study showed that lumbrokinase taken for a year significantly reduced the risk of having a stroke, but it also reduced plaque burden. So that's a pretty big impact on the cardiovascular system. So lumbrokinase is a really, really good candidate for mitigating some of the cardiovascular effects of chronic stress. A partner to lumbrokinase is nattokinase. So again, it's a fibrinolytic enzyme. And so what I like about this particular enzyme is there's been at least 2 studies to show that nattokinase will also lower blood pressure. So oftentimes in chronic uncompensated stress, we'll see elevations in people's blood pressure. So you're getting kind of a 2-for-1 out of this particular product. You can lower blood pressure potentially, but you can also improve some of the coagulation status. And the references are there. On the impact, one of the other major systems in the body, the endocrine system, one of the major long-term effects of chronic uncompensated stress is metabolic dysregulation. So what we see sometimes is elevation in blood sugar, elevation in insulin levels. Sometimes there's alterations to people's cholesterol, total cholesterol, LDL, etc. And so making sure to address that, because metabolic dysregulation is unfortunately very, very common. It's also very, very detrimental to the long-term health, increases the risk of multiple complications over time. So one of the ways to potentially address that is this product, which is a formulation that contains 2 of my absolute favorite ingredients for improving blood sugar levels. And that's the combination of biotin and chromium. So multiple studies have been conducted on these particular ingredients. I like it because it displays a basic understanding of how the body actually utilizes sugar. So our blood sugar, when our blood sugar is elevated, we have too much glucose in the circulation. And what we need to do is get that into the cells where it can be metabolized for fuel. And so chromium is a good addition because it helps to get that glucose actually into the cell. And then biotin is a good partner because it induces enzymes that will help those cells actually use glucose for fuel. So it's a good way of opening the door and getting that glucose into the furnace where it can be used for fuel instead of circulating around the body and causing harm. Other ingredients in this formula include berberine. Berberine has been very well studied for improving metabolic profiles. So multiple studies have shown that will help lower fasting glucose. It will improve cholesterol levels, etc. One of the ingredients in this product that I think is most exciting is actually this European ash. So that background is a picture of what the plant actually looks like. But this one has been pretty rigorously studied in this context of improving metabolic profile in people. And so this particular study did find that it improved glucose insulin sensitivity, it improved blood sugar levels, it improved inflammatory status in the folks that were participated in the study. The next system to think about, the GI system. So chronic uncompensated stress has a huge impact on the gastrointestinal system. Sort of a very common thought is, or picture that we all conjure in our head is people who are under constant stress, they develop ulcers over time, right? So that's sort of the picture. But it is true that chronic stress has a detrimental effect on the gastrointestinal system. It can alter appetite levels. Sometimes it suppresses the appetite so people don't eat very much. Sometimes it goes the other direction where people eat too much. And that, of course, can contribute to weight gain and metabolic dysfunction. It can impact how well the GI system actually moves. So when you eat something, part of it is an assembly line. The food has to move through the digestive system at the appropriate speed for your body to do everything it needs to do to absorb all those nutrients. And then inflammation is another big one. Inflammation, chronic uncompensated stress can contribute to higher levels of inflammation in the gastrointestinal system. And that can cause or contribute to a lot of different issues. So one potential source of relief for that is this particular product, mastic ox bile complex. This is a very interesting formula. It includes multiple demulcent herbs. So licorice and marshmallow are very classic demulcent herbs. So they're considered to be soothing and anti-inflammatory for the digestive system. It contains ox bile, which is helpful for gallbladder support. And then it includes this very interesting ingredient rather, mastic gum. So mastic gum has been used traditionally for a very, very long time, and it has been demonstrated to have antibacterial effects. So it can, if there's any dysbiosis or imbalance in gut bacteria, mastic gum can help address that. It has pretty potent anti-inflammatory effects. So if there is any elevated inflammation in the gastrointestinal system, mastic gum can help to reduce or calm that. And there are some studies to indicate that it promotes healing within the GI system. So if someone has an ulcer or some sort of other patch of inflammation somewhere along the GI tract, mastic gum can promote the healing of that particular injury. And this is a very interesting one in terms of chronic stress and gastrointestinal function. So this is a very, very particular probiotic, Lactobacillus plantarum DR7. So this has been shown, this is the first probiotic that's been shown to impact certain brain functions. And so it's been demonstrated to have sort of an anti-stress or anti-anxiety effect through the impact of neurotransmitters, et cetera. It's been shown to improve cognitive function as well, so certain learning and memory parameters. And then you also get the benefits of probiotics, so some of the gut health and gut-related support. Immune system. So if you recall, one of the effects of cortisol in the body was to suppress immune function. So if you've got sort of chronic activation of the stress response, you've got elevated levels of cortisol, it is potential that you could have suppression of the immune system. And so this is a very interesting product that can help to address that, lactoferrin. It's a derivative peptide from colostrum. For instance, breastfeeding in humans has been shown to really enhance immune function and overall long-term health. And part of the reason for that is the delivery of some of these proteins, these peptides from the mother's milk to baby. Has a direct regulatory and modulatory effect on the immune system. So lactoferrin is a bovine-derived peptide from colostrum. And it has been shown to regulate or modulate immune function, so it can help to stimulate both the innate and the adaptive immune system. And that makes sense if you understand how these peptides are essentially intended to confer protection from mom to baby. The nervous system. Yeah, so chronic uncompensated stress can have a huge impact on the brain and the rest of the nervous system. This is probably the category that's been most well studied. Chronic stress can cause behavioral disorders. So we see things like attention problems, but also alcohol and substance abuse. We see cognitive disorders, so learning and memory issues. We see mood disorders, so increased anxiety, depression, etc. Insomnia comes along with this as well. So making sure that you identify and address these things in folks is important. So here's a super interesting product, molecular H2. So what happens here is these tablets, you drop it in water, it dissolves, and essentially super saturates the water with molecular hydrogen. Molecular hydrogen has been shown to have the right properties for crossing the blood-brain barrier. So it's easily absorbed. It crosses the blood-brain barrier and can get into the brain. And there, it can have a pretty potent anti-inflammatory effect. And inflammation is considered to be at the root of some of what stress does in the brain over time. So this is a good, very safe way of helping to reduce inflammation in the brain. And then this is a great formula that works very, very well. So this is Zen. It's a combination of GABA and L-theanine. So GABA is one of the major inhibitory neurotransmitters in the brain. So what happens in chronic stress is sometimes the brain can become overstimulated, overexcited through the action of excitatory neurotransmitters. GABA is a good way to calm that down. And so what we see with GABA is sort of the regulation of neurotransmitter function, reductions in stress, reductions in anxiety, improved sleep. So this is a good sort of master regulator in the brain. And then L-theanine is in green tea. It's long been recognized for its calming properties, its anti-anxiety properties, but it does also help to regulate or support the balance of neurotransmitters in the brain. This product also comes in liposomal form, meaning it's been enhanced for absorption. The blood-brain barrier sometimes separates what can get into the brain, from the systemic circulation, and so liposomal formulation will help actually get these things into the brain, helps improve their fat solubility. So liposomal Zen is an enhanced formulation of this particular product. So at this point, I would see if there are any questions.
All right. Any new and exciting formulations we can look forward to from allergy research?
Yeah, it's a good question. I know that there are some coming down the pike, but I don't have a direct answer. I don't have a very specific answer for that.
Okay. Just thought I'd get a little previews. Any questions? No, we're good.
Well, thank you.